Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. I'm Carrie Anderson, production editor for TNSR. Today, I'm talking with Qiqin Zhang, who wrote Just Do It, explaining the characteristics and rationale of Chinese economic sanctions for Volume 7, Issue 3 of TNSR. Qiqin is an assistant professor of international security at George Mason University, and her first book was China's Gambit, The Calculus of Coercion. So, Qiqin, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thanks for having me.
So, in your article for TNSR, you wrote that China tends to impose economic sanctions in ways that are vague and not explicitly announced. So how does that work, and how is it different from the way that, say, the United States tends to use sanctions?
Right. That's a great question. So for the article, I constructed a data set of Chinese economic sanctions from 1990 to the early 2020s. And I found that in the data set, about 87% of the cases of Chinese economic sanctions are vague and unannounced. And about 13% of Chinese economic sanctions were actually explicitly announced but not implemented. So let me give an example of a vague and unannounced Chinese economic sanctions and how that differs from, say, sanctions imposed by the United States. So let's start with the bananas in the South China Sea. China has maritime territorial disputes with countries in the South China Sea, for example, the Philippines, which is an U.S. ally. And in 2012, China and the Philippines had disputes over one of the rocks in the South China Sea that's called the Scarborough Shoal. And China imposed economic sanctions on the Philippines, but it's not your usual total embargo, right, in terms of trades and goods. Instead, what China did was to impose a banana ban against Filipino banana exports to China, essentially letting Filipino bananas going rotten in Chinese ports. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry did not announce this case as an episode of economic sanctions. If anything, in similar cases, the Chinese Foreign Ministry will actively deny that China imposed economic sanctions in the first place. So what China usually did was to use the rhetoric of pest control issues or quality or safety control issues of these goods that are being imported into China, and did not announce it as a form of economic sanctions in response to perceived threats to its national security. So in these cases of vague Chinese economic sanctions, i.e. not announced, and oftentimes they are essentially directly implemented, which is why the title of this article is Just Do It, because the Chinese government follows Nike's model of just do it. And these kinds of economic sanctions can be very different from the standard economic sanctions that we might know a little bit more from, for example, the United States. An example of U.S. economic sanctions would be after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States announced a ban against Russia from the SWIFT system, right? So these examples of sanctions will tend to be approved by Congress, and the US president will explicitly announce these economic sanctions. So I think that's the major difference between Chinese, or at least the 87% of those Chinese economic sanctions versus standard sanctions imposed by, say, Western or OECD countries.
And do you think that when China imposes these sanctions, because it's not being explicit and because it's not giving a warning, are other countries getting the intended message?
Presumably, if leaders are rational, they impose sanctions with the expected result of changing the behavior of the target state, as well as, say, the countries surrounding that target state, right? So the issue with inexplicit or a vague sanctions, especially unimplemented ones, would be that it would be difficult for either the target state or the countries surrounding the target state to know that sanctions were actually imposed in the first place. So I think the Chinese government knows the issue or the ineffectiveness related to vague sanctions. So their way of addressing this is to implement the sanctions. So in other words, when states impose economic sanctions, there are sort of two ways of doing that, right? So for some of the sanctions that the United States imposed, it started at the threat stage. In other words, it's not necessarily, or it does not have to be implemented per se. And sometimes the mere threat of economic sanctions could be sufficient to change the behavior of the target state, but it has to be explicit, right, for it to be taken seriously. But in the case of China, these 87% of economic sanctions were not explicitly announced. And because of that, the Chinese government believes that in order for these vague sanctions to have any impact, it's better for those sanctions to be carried out. In other words, even though they were not explicitly framed as economic sanctions, other countries, including the target state where this, say, ban is being imposed, they technically can still view the results. So, for example, in the case of the Philippines, that's bananas rotten in like Chinese ports. These are reported, right, in the media, and other surrounding countries or countries in Southeast Asia that have maritime territorial disputes with China, they can still observe the impact of these vague bans on, for example, the Philippines. And the expected result is that these countries observe what happened to the Philippines, and they might be deterred from doing similar things in the future, things that China considers to be threatening its, say, national security.
What does China see in terms of advantages to this approach versus explicit sanctions?
This question is partially what started this article, right? Because when I was observing these cases of Chinese economic sanctions in my earlier days, many moons ago, back in grad school, it's very different from the standard literature that we learned in international political economy of sanctions imposed by Western countries who were developed market economies. So the reason, so that's why I began to examine why does China impose these like relatively vague sanctions, especially if they don't necessarily lend China the most or the maximum effectiveness in terms of sending strong and clear signals. The major explanation that I found in the article for why China imposes these vague sanctions and then carried them out is that China is concerned about rules at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And of course, the WTO is pro-trade, right? It tries to reduce the amount of trade restrictions, but at the same time, the WTO does have, and one of the rules does have exception for national security issues, and that is the national security exception clause in the WTO rules. And there is specific wording in this clause with regard to what constitutes as what's called essential national security threats or national security issues. And in addition to this criterion of being essential national security concerns, the clause also suggests that any trade restrictions that are going to be imposed in response to these essential national security concerns will need to be directly related to those national security concerns. So in that sense, let's use this banana example again. First off, those territorial disputes in the South China Seas, I think China would have a much harder time to justify them as essential national security concerns. So Taiwan could, I think, in principle, be counted as a potential essential security threat or security concern, but the rocks in the South China Sea, I don't think they're objectively threatening enough to be counted as essential security, national security concerns. So the second layer to why China would be having a hard time to invoke the national security exception clause is that we talked about in the clause, the goods that are restricted should be directly related to the national security concern. But in a lot of China's cases of these on vague bans, for example, the banana ban, or in other cases, banning Taiwanese citrus fruits exports to China, or banning salmon exports from Norway to China, these goods are not directly related to the national security concern at hand. One cannot plausibly argue that bananas are related to, right, or conducive to, or are threatening to China's national security in the South China Sea. And I think because of these two concerns, China cannot plausibly argue that it can invoke the national security exception clause. And the issue with this then is if these sanctions were explicitly announced by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, then afterwards the target country could plausibly use it against China at the WTO, for example, using the dispute resolution mechanism, and China could potentially receive WTO lawsuits, right, from these countries. So because of that, for the 87% of Chinese economic sanctions in my data set, China kept it at the vague and unannounced level. Essentially, it is, I would say, because I study gray zone as a coercive measure in my book on China's coercion, I would say that these vague and inexplicit Chinese economic sanctions, it's somewhat akin to the gray zone of Chinese economic sanctions. In other words, it lends China plausible deniability because these are vague and unannounced. The target country could raise this issue at the WTO as trade restrictions, but it cannot plausibly treat this issue as China unlawfully using economic sanctions because these are vague. So I think these vague sanctions are intended to create plausible deniability for China at the WTO.
And you did mention that in your data set, while the vast majority of cases were ambiguous and unannounced, that there were a few cases where China imposed sanctions more explicitly and in the way that we typically think of Western countries doing it. So what's different about those cases, and why would China be more explicit?
That's a great question. When I was writing, because this article took quite a few years to write, and when I started with this article, I mostly looked at cases similar to the banana ban. And I assume that was sort of in the earlier stage of writing this article that is how China imposed economic sanctions. But later, especially I think with some of the suggestions from the wonderful reviewers at TNSR for this article, I realized that I need to be more comprehensive and to make this into a data set just to see if there are consistent patterns of China's rhetoric and characteristics of of sanctions over the years. So what I found through this data set is that although the vast majority of Chinese economic sanctions were indeed vague and unannounced and implemented, at the same time, there are cases of Chinese economic sanctions that are actually explicitly announced and not implemented. So all those cases converge on US weapons sales to Taiwan. And in those cases, the usual scenario is that the Chinese Foreign Ministry will issue an explicit announcement of economic sanctions on companies that are involved in selling weapons to Taiwan. Essentially, those mostly will be about companies such as Boeing, Lockheed Martin, companies that produce these weapons platforms, which are then being transferred to Taiwan. My argument for why these cases are explicit is that, remember, we talked about the national security exception clause, right? That talked about in order for sanctions to be justified under WTO rules, they need to be about essential national security, and the goods or the entities that are involved in these sanctions should be directly related to that essential national security concern. So US companies that sell weapons, that produce and then sell weapons to Taiwan fall into this category. So if there is any essential national security concern that China can justify, it's most likely going to be about Taiwan. And in addition to that, the companies that are involved are directly related to the issue at hand, right? Weapons sales to Taiwan. So I think that's why the Chinese government feels more comfortable in explicitly announcing economic sanctions on these companies. Now, the interesting part about this is that China rarely implemented the economic sanctions on these companies that it's announced in the first place. And I think there are two reasons to that. And the first one has more to do with companies like Boeing. China does need to import Boeing aircraft. So it's not realistic for China to actually ban Boeing aircraft. So I think that's sort of the part where the United States has leverage over China, in the sense that these are threats of sanctions, but China can hardly carry them out. And as for other companies such as Lockheed Martin, they don't really have that much, I think, business or interests within China. And my understanding is that they have indirect subsidiaries in China, but it's not a large part of their business. So in other words, China does not have leverage over these companies, and the explicitly announced threats of economic sanctions in these cases were more, I think, for signaling purposes. So I think it's a little bit more of like a political posturing as opposed to really trying to pack a punch against US companies.
That's really interesting. So it's sort of signaling unhappiness with the United States providing these weapons, but then not actually really taking action about it.
Exactly. And then I think the large issue is that China might have or would have wanted to do something, but they couldn't really do anything because of, I think, the economic leverage that the United States has over China, at least in certain parts of the economy.
And of course, there's a lot of literature out there about economic sanctions and national security and effectiveness, at least in terms of the way the United States and European countries use sanctions. So, where do you see your research fitting within that broader field of study?
In my view, there is a great literature on economic sanctions, and I think that's partially what drew me in to start this article as well as my larger book, which came out last year, is because that book actually started out from this bananas. So it was only about economic sanctions in the first place. I think the literature on economic sanctions is vast and wonderfully rich. But my understanding about the literature, and that is not a critique against the literature, it's just more of a description of the lay of the land of the literature. So the vast majority of the economic sanctions literature, starting or going back to, I would say, the Cold War era, is about evaluating the effectiveness or lack thereof of sanctions. In other words, whether sanctions work or not. It makes perfect sense because it is a policy tool, and both policymakers and scholars are naturally interested in analyzing whether it works or not. So the literature that within the sanctions literature that examines why states and how states impose economic sanctions is a little bit more of a minority, which is where I'm sort of contributing to. In other words, I'm not looking at the effectiveness part of China of a state's economic sanctions. Rather, I'm looking more at first why they impose sanctions, whom they target, and in this article in particular, the characteristics. How do they impose economic sanctions? And the second reason for where the second area where I see this article speaks to the larger sanctions literature is that the sanctions literature tends to focus more on Western or OECD countries. And I think which is why our sort of standard understanding of economic sanctions is like the US style sanctions, like very formal, backed by domestic laws and formally announced and explicitly announced as well. But the literature on how authoritarian states or contemporary rising powers or powers that are not in this sort of traditional OECD or Western country camp, like democracies, impose sanctions is, I think, relatively burgeoning. And that's why I'm sort of adding to this burgeoning literature that examines how authoritarian states like China, a non-democracy, imposes economic sanctions. Because the way that non-democracies impose economic sanctions and the reasons for those economic sanctions can be very different from how democracies impose sanctions. Because the standard economic sanctions literature would suggest that for most of the sanctions imposed by democracies, it's mostly for human rights or environmental protection or political reasons, right? Not necessarily about national security. But for authoritarian states, you don't really see them imposing sanctions because of human rights abuses, etc. So I think these are the two sort of major areas where I see this article speaks to the broader economic sanctions literature. And I think a third aspect of this article speaks a little bit more to the specific literature on Chinese economic statecraft and Chinese economic sanctions, which is wonderful and also burgeoning. But I think it does, again, examine or focus more on the evaluation aspect, i.e., were Chinese economic sanctions effective? Does Chinese economic statecraft reach the goals, or under what circumstances would such efforts have been undermined? So this article gets at a slightly different question, not looking at effectiveness, but mostly focusing on why are we seeing these vague and unannounced sanctions.
And So I think your sources for this article sounded really interesting and quite varied. I think you had interviews as well as other forms of research. So could you talk a little bit about your sourcing for this?
So I use several kinds of sources for this article in order to, I guess, cross-check against one another and to reduce, potential bias due to over relying on a certain kind of source over another. So I use both behavioral indicators as well as primary written documents and interviews for this paper. So for behavioral evidence, essentially that's about the data set and the descriptive statistics, right, coming out of that data set. So using behavioral indicators can be useful because oftentimes what you see is what you get. You don't really have Chinese government propaganda, right, from those data and behavioral indicators. And that's why I try to use as much behavioral data as possible. But in addition to that, there is a caveat where there is an issue with only relying on behavioral indicators with behavioral data because you don't necessarily see the deliberation of decision making or the logic of why states do X, Y, and Z by only observing behavioral data, which is why I'm also using these primary speech evidence, including both written materials as well as interviews. So for the written materials, I use several kinds. And I do refer to WTO rules quite a bit just to set, I guess, the background that there are valid concerns for why states may not plausibly argue that sanctions are justified. And in addition, I also try to cross-check with Chinese writing, in particular in regard to Chinese writings of Chinese government analysts, as well as Chinese scholars and sometimes former officials to see if they actually talk about the WTO rules the way that the WTO rules are stated, right, in these international economic institutions. And if they're in line with, or if they are concerned about potentially not justifying, being able to justify economic sanctions, then that's a stronger piece of evidence that that is factored into the consideration of vague and unexplicit Chinese economic sanctions. So that's why I use a large amount of articles from what's called the Chinese National Knowledge Infrastructure CNKI database, which is sort of like, I guess, the JSTOR here in the United States, which has been, I think, in a way censored by the Chinese government. So for example, George Mason University has bought access to it. But in recent years, even though the university bought it, we cannot access it because the Chinese government actually censors overseas use of this. So what I did was to try to access it through the Library of Congress, which still has continuous access of these articles. So I think I looked at over 250 articles written by Chinese government analysts, as well as scholars, and some were written by former officials in, for example, the Ministry of Commerce. So these sources can be more convincing in a way as an indicator of how the Chinese government, what the government is thinking, what is the rationale for these vague and inexplicit sanctions. And finally, I did utilize some interviews, but I think a lot of those interviews were ones that I did when I was doing field work a few years back, mostly in the 2015 to 2016 period, when it was easier to get access to interviews. But because of COVID and the gradual or drastic tightening of the local control over the past couple of years, it's harder to get interviews, especially directly at these questions, which is why I think the article relies primarily on written sources, mostly from this CNKI, Chinese Academic Article Database.
So, what broader conclusions do you think we can draw about China's foreign policy based on how the country approaches sanctions?
I think one sort of key, I guess, lesson for me, both from writing this article as well as my first book, is that oftentimes the media here in the United States is perception about China is that it's aggressive, it goes to the extreme. But the reality is that China does use coercion, but oftentimes in a much more middle of the path kind of measure. I would call it a Goldilocks kind of choice, right? China does use coercion, but most of the time, it does not actually escalate to military coercion. It stays somewhat in the middle, using, for example, gray zone coercion. And in the case of this article, it uses economic sanctions, but oftentimes it's like these like small punches, bananas or salmon. And in addition to that, it's oftentimes quite vague because it wants to evade international institutions or constraints from international institutions. So I think sort of the biggest lesson for me when it comes to understanding China is to sort of understand this duality of Chinese foreign policy approaches, right? It is assertive and aggressive in a way because coercion is by definition negative. But at the same time, rarely would you see China escalate to more drastic measures of, say, economic sanctions or military coercion. However, Taiwan definitely is the exception in this regard because we do see military coercion, which just happened, I think, like about 2 weeks ago in response to President Lai Ching-te's speech. And when it comes to weapon sales to Taiwan, China does make explicitly announced economic sanctions. So I think Goldilocks choice is probably what I would, or how I would describe Chinese foreign policy in general.
Well, this has been so interesting. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering what's next for you in your research?
So I'm currently in the process of writing my second book that seeks to examine the grand strategies of both historical rising powers and contemporary rising powers. So that essentially means understanding the grand strategies of historical Bismarck in Germany, interwar Japan, and the early American Republic, and to see whether these grand strategies would be similar or different as compared to the grand strategy of contemporary China. And I'm particularly interested in understanding whether and how economic interdependence might affect a rising powers grand strategy, with the central hypothesis being economic interdependence has existed for a long time, and historical rising powers certainly did have economic interdependence with both their rivals as well as other smaller countries in the world. But the kind of economic interdependence that the contemporary world is experiencing, and that includes China as well, is different from historical rising powers economic interdependence. So what that means is that contemporary economic interdependence, I would argue, is characterized by production and supply chains. A lot of the things that China produces and exports, for example, the Huawei cell phone, depends on intermediate products, like key intermediate products that require high technologies from, for example, US allies and partners around the world, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. So I would argue that this production and supply chain level of economic interdependence has a simultaneous restraining but also enabling effect on China's grand strategy. What that means is that oftentimes you're going to see contemporary China using more non-militarized coercive tools, economic sanctions being one example of that, but does not resort to the use of force as frequently as compared to historical rising powers. But at the same time, we do see more frequent use of economic sanctions from contemporary rising powers. And one sort of final observation from this second book project is that as compared to or in contrast to historical rising powers, China does not want to be locked into these formal alliances because it does not see where it thinks that using military force can be quite costly and does not want to be dragged into military obligations that it views as unnecessary for defending its own national security interests. So this sort of last observation is something that I'm currently working on in a different paper. So not a book length project, but just an article length paper that seeks to examine the different kinds of partnerships that China has, which is, again, going back to this Goldilocks kind of analogy. It's a similar kind of logic. In other words, China does not want to form formal alliances because it wants to shirk military obligations, but at the same time, it wants to gain political and economic benefits from these partnerships with, I think, currently 108 countries in the world. So these partnerships are somewhat similar to this gray zone tactics or vague economic sanctions as China's approach to gain leverage or to gain economic and political benefits without being locked into military obligations. So these are the two major projects that I'm currently working on.
Great. That sounds so interesting. I think we'll have some really interesting, valuable insights for both policymakers and scholars. So thank you so much for being on Horns of a Dilemma and for writing for TNSR.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.